let me get into what are quickly the advantages of TTIP. Already Europe is our largest trading partner. Half of the global economic output of the world is in Europe and the United States. It's $6.5 trillion a year of trade that goes back and forth between the United States and Europe in goods and services every year.
I think the fundamental reason that a TTIP agreement, a good TTIP agreement, is in the U.S. national interest is jobs and growth. That was the approach that the U.S. and EU took as they took about a year and a half to study the idea of doing a TTIP very carefully. And equally importantly, this is the opportunity for the two big industrial democracies in the world who share so many values, including private property and intellectual property and workers' rights and protecting the environment, but also democracy and free speech and rule of law, to try and come up with a template for a high standard trade agreement.
We're all quoting from the same study here. They prefer to quote gross numbers. I'll give it to you in percentage terms. If you right now make $50,000 a year, TTIP is the equivalent of me offering you a raise to $50,125 in 15 years' time, provided that you do everything I tell you to do in the interim. Bear that in mind when our opponents talk about the enormous geopolitical, economic, geostrategic effects of TTIP.
And you could ask the question, why do we even need a trade agreement with the European Union? And I think this actually goes to Ted's original point, which is that we have low tariffs, relatively speaking, on both sides right now, and investment flows pretty freely. So what do we gain from a free trade agreement? Or is this one of those areas where we have an answer in search of a question?
We hear it trade agreement after trade agreement from proponents of trade agreements that they'll bring more jobs to the U.S., better jobs to the U.S., higher paying jobs to the U.S. What do you say to opponents who are concerned about the loss of U.S. jobs associated with the TTIP agreement?
There are loss of jobs. There's no question about it. There's loss of jobs that come about, but not so much as a result of a trade agreement. It comes about as a result of the whole process of globalization and changes in the world economy. We can sit back, put our head in the sand, deny ever having an agreement with any country on any level of trade, and you're still going to have the changes that are taking place in the world today.
When 95% of the consumers in the world live outside of the U.S., when 80% of the purchasing power in the world is outside of the U.S., to be able to create good jobs and keep good jobs here, we're going to be a lot better if we can get in there and get those barriers away, including in Europe, so we can get in there and let our companies and our workers have a chance to compete.
And Ted, do you buy into that argument that it's not trade agreements that lead to the loss of jobs in the U.S., but rather globalization?
Trade agreements aren't the only factor that leads to loss of jobs, but they certainly are an exacerbating factor. And I think our negotiators have not figured out how to negotiate a trade agreement that produces good jobs in the United States and that helps workers at the lower end of the income spectrum.
I would just add to that I'm a convinced supporter of the benefits of free trade and economic freedom. I'm also convinced that there is nothing that we currently import from China or any other country that we could not make in the United States. We would thereby be vastly poorer if we made everything in the United States. And we would have perhaps more jobs, but we would certainly have a great many lower paying jobs as well.
I want to go to each of our panelists and ask them in 1 minute to sum up what he or she believes the U.S. should do right now as a matter of U.S. trade policy with Europe.
So what should the U.S. do in terms of these negotiations? Well, one easy thing that I would put on the table is to drop the investor-state dispute settlement. This is something which is unnecessary in the U.S.-European context, and then put a lot of emphasis on the labor and environment chapters. I think that's where there's a real potential to negotiate something that was truly innovative and could help workers on both sides.
Let me just put it to you simply. The war for free trade in the North Atlantic area is essentially over, and the free traders have won. And that's a good thing. There are a few things that we could do in the context of TTIP that would be a marginal additional benefit. Eliminate any remaining tariffs, eliminate any remaining quotas, and instead of trying to cover everything in an enormous TTIP agreement, focus on a very few areas that promise high gains, and with all due respect to my fellow panelists, simply agree to mutually recognize each other's standards and move on.
What can the United States do now for TTIP or for trade? We could get the Congress to approve trade promotion authority so that the president can proceed with getting the negotiation going forward. Without that, we will never have a TTIP. So Congress, get on the stick and pass the TPA so that we can keep moving forward.
We face a fundamental choice. Everybody does, but let's talk from the U.S. side. You can either recognize that globalization is here and try to deal with it and manage it, and a strong TTIP can be part of it, or we can try and deny it and turn back the clock and live in the good old days, when it was a lot simpler, when you could make everything in America and you didn't have to worry about supply chains. We got to accept reality. Nostalgia is not a strategy for competitiveness and jobs in the 21st century. TTIP is a strategy for doing that, and that's what we ought to do.